It's time for a chime video. We have a lot of videos about working on NuTone door chimes. In those videos, or in some of those videos, I show sort of a step-by-step and go through what you have to do to restore a chime so it works correctly again. And we do sell and have some parts to work on NuTone chimes. We have things like springs, we have grommets, we have end caps, we have cushions, and all of those sort of things. And those are parts that we send out periodically when people need them because they're trying to fix their chime. One of the things that people call about are, I need tips for my NuTone plungers for my chime. And this is what they're talking about. So here's a NuTone plunger, and you can see the little red tip. This particular plunger with the red tip is out of this power unit solenoid here. This is a late 50s or early 60s NuTone solenoid assembly, and it's out of a 2-note long tube chime. So it goes ding dong, but it has 2 long brass tubes. They're very nice chimes. When this plunger was new, you had 2 tips. It still has one red one here, but this one on this side is missing. And people call me up just like this fella did and said, I'm trying to fix my chime, but I'm missing the tip on this end. He's also missing other parts. And so you understand, this video isn't specifically about this assembly. It's about putting tips in plungers for all NuTone chimes that were made between approximately 1950 and probably somewhere into the mid or late 80s. After that, some things changed on some chimes, and that's a little more complicated. I explained to the fella that we can do tips, but tips don't come pre-made as if they came from NuTone. Here you see the end of the remnant of a little red tip in this plunger, and what we're going to do, what I'm going to show you how to do is I'm going to show you how you make new tips in a plunger out of this. Now you'll notice that these pieces are much longer than this piece, and there's a reason why. So first, you're probably wondering what happens to the tips. Well, what happens to the tips is, just like this one, it fell out. So why did it fall out? Well, it fell out mostly because it's really old. And you'll notice this one, if I just grab it with the needle nose pliers here and pull carefully, it slid right out. And I did not pull very hard. When this was brand new, so before I took it out, it was about there, I would say. And where it's supposed to be is about right there. About twice as long, probably. So what happens to these are, when this was made brand new, inside the hole, on the end of the plunger right there, there are sort of little tiny threads inside the metal. And then this tip, I suppose, would have been very carefully, someone would have sat there and very carefully sort of threaded it into the end of the plunger until it was the right length. Now what happens is, after, let's say this was made in 1960, so that makes it about 62 years old. So after 62 years of slamming into the brass tube over and over and over and over again, it very gradually pushes the tip back inside the plunger hole. Problem with the design originally is that the depth of the hole in the end of the plunger is much deeper than the amount of tip that's threaded into it. As an example, what we're going to do is we're going to take this toothpick here and we're going to insert it into the hole, and I'm going to mark it with a red marker, and then we're going to take it out, and you can see based on the red mark how deep the hole is. Now, because we're all about being thorough here, we're going to very quickly measure this and see how deep this actually is. I have a pretty good idea, but it's important to know. So we'll line it up exactly, and this is about 11.18 millimeters deep. That's how deep the hole in the end of the plunger is. How far was the little red tip screwed into the hole? Well, if we measure this, we're going to find out that it was screwed in about 5.66 millimeters, which in just round math, it's about halfway. So when this was installed new, when this was threaded into this, it doesn't go all the way down to the back of the hole. There's a big gap behind it. And that's why over time, as it slams into the brass tubes over and over again, they get pushed down inside. Of course, once they get pushed down inside, the threads in the plastic tip itself have been all kind of stripped out, and at some point, for whatever reason, the tip will fly out and fall on the floor and roll and fall down the heat duct, and then you'll never find it. And that's what happens on these. That happens a lot. Now let's talk about tips in general. Originally, when NuTone first started making door chimes, and all of the chimes were 2-note chimes, all of the tips in the plungers were actually made out of wood. And we have videos where I show chimes that were made in like 1936 and 1937, and they have wooden tips. On the 4- and 8-note chimes that they made back in those days, and through about 1949, there was that gap in the middle where they didn't make any chimes because there was that whole World War II thing going on. The plungers on the 4- and 8-note chimes, on the ends of the plungers, the tips were actually made out of some kind of either felt or leather. That was very common on like grandfather clocks and things like that. That's what the strikers would have on them. That was abandoned after a while. It was probably too expensive, and starting roughly in 1950, all NuTone chimes had plastic tips on their plungers. Tip material does make a difference in how the chime sounds. Wooden tips sound one way, leather tips sound a different way, and plastic tips, they sound their own way. In looking for a material that we can use to repair and replace tips on NuTone chimes, I looked and looked and looked and looked, trying to find something that I thought was most appropriate, and what I came up with is this material. So this is a fiberglass rod, and the fiberglass rod works really well. It's very similar in sound to the plastic tips. It doesn't sound anything like wooden tips or leather tips, but for the majority of the chimes that we work on, this is what we use. Of course, when we looked for this, the goal is you need a material that's the right diameter so it fits down inside the hole properly. Of course, that exact size in any material you look at doesn't exist. Either it's way too big or it's way too small. Never gonna find. I looked, I've got a whole box full of different samples of different kinds of rod material looking for something that was exactly the right size, and I don't think it's actually made in the world. I assume that the tips that NuTone made were made out of some material that they bought, I don't know, a zillion miles of and used it forever or something. So I like the fiberglass tip material, and you'll notice, I showed you before, this is actually very long. This piece right here is 1.25 inches long because that's the size that we cut the fiberglass rod into, so I have it ready to go when I need it, and that's the starting point for making new tips inside any NuTone plunger. When we make replacement tips, we do it different than NuTone. I think my way is better. What we do is we take the tip material and we insert it all the way down into the full depth of the hole in the end of the plunger so that the end of the rod sits against the bottom of the hole so it cannot be driven back in. It gives it a lot more security. It won't fall out, and also I'll show you how we make sure that doesn't happen, but it prevents it from becoming a problem later on from all of the pounding on the brass tubes. That's why we're starting off with 1.25 inch piece, and that's also why you can't just buy this pre-made and then stick it in the hole of your plunger, because you have to make it up in each end as you go. And that's what I'm going to show you how to do. So what are you going to need to do that? Well, you're going to need your plunger. You're going to need 2 pieces if you have this type of tip material, or however many tips you have to make. Some chimes have 4. The best rule that you should follow here is that you should not, even if there's an original one in here, you should not have a mix of old and new. If you're going to do one, do them both, because that way it sounds the same on each note, because the material that's striking the tubes or the tone bars is the same kind of material. So you need your plunger. You need to make sure that the holes are reasonably clean inside, and I don't mean clean like you got to wash them out. I mean like no debris from a broken plastic piece or somebody glued a nail in there at some point or some other thing. You just need to have a nice hole that's cleaned out so you can put the new tip material in it. You're going to need a piece of sandpaper. This is a piece of 220 grit, just regular sandpaper you can buy at the hardware store or something like that. And you're going to need some gel super glue. This is Loctite super glue. It's ultra gel control, so you know it must be good because it has a really fancy name. I buy this at Home Depot because they sell it there. It's in the paint department. They have lots of different kinds. Buy the gel type. Don't buy the runny kind of super glue. Buy the gel kind because it works better for what we're going to do. So you're going to need that. You're going to need probably a cordless drill. At least that's what I use because it makes my life easier. And that's pretty much it. And you need a little bit of patience and a little bit of time. So let's go ahead and get started. All right, so the first thing we're going to do, we're going to do one at a time. We're going to take one piece of tip material. We're going to take it and put it in the chuck of the drill like that. So it's about 1/3 in, the rest sticking out the end here. See, sticking out the end. And then you're going to take your sandpaper. See the white marks on the sandpaper? Guess what this gets used for? This gets used for sanding down tip material to fit inside plungers, and that's why those marks are on there. See, no marks here, but soon there will be. So what you do is you take the sandpaper and you wrap it around the tip, and you don't really need to do the whole thing. Remember the depth of the hole? Well, that's how far down we really need to sand this down very lightly, and it doesn't take very much to do this. If you make it too small, then you have to do it again. Just wrap it around like this and then go like this. And that's probably a good start. And then you take your plunger and you insert the tip into there. Now what you want is, you want it to go in as far as it can all the way to the bottom. So to show you that, I've got it stuffed in there now, and I'm going to take it off, and it's a nice snug fit. And you can see the red mark right there. And if we take our red mark on our toothpick and we put them like this, it is fully down into the depth of the hole. It's sitting in the back of the hole. So that one turned out perfect. So we'll take that out. We're going to put this back in here like this for right now. And now we're going to do number 2. See the mark? That's where I sanded it. What are these marks from? That's why I sanded other ones before. In case you're wondering, yes, I have done this before. We'll put that one in there. I'm going to mark it just to show. I don't usually mark them when I do them all the time because I do them all the time. I can sort of tell. That one's perfect also. These turned out really, really well. Sometimes if you get overly excited with your sanding down of the fiberglass rod, it will become too small. You don't want that. You want it to be a nice, tight, snug fit. So this one fits in there like that, and now all of a sudden we have a plunger that has 2 tips. You might think we're done, but you'd be wrong. The next thing we have to do is we have to glue the tips with the gel super glue into the ends of the plungers. And some of you might be going, oh no, what is he doing? It's crazy. You don't need to use gel super glue. Well, of course you do. So what you do is you very carefully squeeze a little bit down into there. Doesn't need to be a lot, and yes, it's going to squish out, and no, it doesn't matter. And then you take the tip and I sort of turn it and press it in like that. If you get too much, it'll squish out the top, and I'm going to put too much in the second one just so I can show you. Alright, that's way too much. So I'm going to put this in, twist and push. And when you put too much and you twist and push, you're going to get a little air pocket behind it, and then it's going to want to pop back out. So you got to like pull it out, let the air out, and then put it in again, and all that kind of stuff. And you can see on the end right here, the brown stuff. That's the gel super glue that sort of oozed out when you put the tip in. And what I like to do is I take my finger and I go like this and wipe most of it away, leaving just a little bit on the outside. That's not going to interfere with everything. Now I've got gel super glue on my finger. Oh my God, what are we going to do? Don't stick your fingers together, and if you do, acetone will dissolve it. Just wipe it on the rag. It'll be fine. All right, so now we've sanded down our tips and we gel super glued them into the plungers. What do you think we're going to do next? We're going to wait because we need the gel super glue to dry. How long are we going to wait? That's really easy. We're going to wait 1 entire day. For those of you who are unclear on 1 entire day, that would be a full 24 hours. So right now it is 1:40 on Thursday afternoon, and we're not going to come back to this until tomorrow at 1:40 in the afternoon, because you need to let the gel super glue dry, because the next thing we have to do is, once this is all dry, we have to measure the length of tip that we need and then mark it, and then we have to cut it off because we have to make it the right length. Right now, way too long. This, you could put this in here like this, but it's too long and the chime's not going to work properly. In fact, these are so long right now that it would go past the tube and it would never be able to hit it because it's all wrong. So you can't do that. The other thing about this is, and this one turned out really well because they fit really snugly. If your tips aren't really snug and straight, which they should be because I showed you how to do it, you don't want them to be glued in and then leaning at an angle like this. They have to be straight up and down, because when you put it back in the solenoid, which I'm going to do right now, when it energizes, it's got to slide through the hole in the end like that. And if they're crooked, then they won't. The other thing that you want to do is, this needs to dry somewhere. And you don't necessarily want to lean it up and get something like this, or you don't want to put any stress that's going to push the tips around or anything like that. You want it to dry kind of straight. So what I'm going to do is, I'm just going to take it and put it, it'll be on the shelf over there, but I'm just going to sit it like that and it'll be fine. So I will be back in 24 hours and then we're going to finish this up. I'm back. So 24 hours have passed and the new tip material that we super glued into the plunger on each end right here has dried thoroughly, and now these are very well stuck in. There's no void behind the end of the tip material. It's all the way down in the bottom of the hole. So it's going to stay there and it's not going to fall out again in the future. Our next step is we have to trim these to length for whichever particular chime this plunger is going into. Your chime, if it's a different model than this one, will not be these lengths. And I'm not even going to actually tell you what the lengths are because it's not relevant to what this video is about. This is about how you fashion tips. So whatever model chime you have to figure out what the length is. One of the things that you can't do is, if you have some nubby little tip left over, and I think you remember, I kept them right here, we had these little red pieces that were in here. You can't necessarily go by that, because if it was pushed back in, you don't know how far it's supposed to stick out, so you don't really know, and it can be a problem. A lot of the videos about different specific types of NuTone chimes have drawings, or I explain how long the tips should be, so you have to research into it a little bit. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to mark these for their length before we go ahead and trim them. And I'm not really going to tell you how long I'm going to make them, because like I said, it's not really relevant to what this video is about. And you want to try to make them as close to the exact length as they were originally. Don't think that making them longer is going to be a good thing. So I should cover up the caliper so you can't see. Well, I got to put my magnifiers on, otherwise it's too hard to see. And I'm just going to mark the tip with the red felt pen, because that's the way I like to do it. So there's one. This particular one, I will tell you, the tips on each end are different lengths, because that's the way this chime was designed. Like that. So now I have them marked. Now we have to trim them off. And trimming them off can be done in a variety of different ways. The way I normally like to do it is, I have these little razor saws like this. You can buy these on Amazon, although you probably don't want to buy it if you're ever going to do this just once. They're just really super fine little straight back saws. This one has 32 teeth per inch, so it's pretty fine. If you don't have something like this, you can also use a hacksaw blade with a fine tooth count on it, because that works fine also. The way I normally like to do this is I like to put them in the chuck of the cordless drill and then spin them, but in this particular case, because we've got tip material sticking out of both ends, the chuck in the cordless drill won't grab onto the metal part of the plunger like I need it to, so it's straight. Don't grab onto the tip material and try to spin it, because that will make a disaster probably. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to walk out into the other part of the shop a minute. You don't get to see this, and I'm going to trim these off on the bandsaw. So I'll be right back. So what I did was I trimmed off this one to make it shorter so it will fit in the chuck of the cordless drill. Now you might notice, if you look carefully, I didn't trim it on the red line, and you're probably thinking, why didn't he trim it on the red line? Well, because the bandsaw cuts the rod material kind of roughly and sort of feathers it, so I don't want all of that. I want it to be a nice, clean, smooth cut, and that's what the little saw is really for. So I'm going to put this in here like this. See, now we can spin it. The other thing that I normally do, just because it's fun to do, is I'll take the red felt pen and I'll spin it kind of slowly and draw a line all the way around on it. Not that you really have to do that. That's just something I like to do. What we're going to do is we're going to put it over the rag here to catch the dust. And I think you probably can see we're cutting right here. And all I'm going to do is run the drill and saw it off. That's how long it actually took. Once we did that end, I'm going to flip it around and then we'll trim the other end. And yes, I do this way every single time. Do I have to? No. I'm a big believer in you don't have to reinvent the wheel every time you do something. Come up with a method that works really well and then you stick to it. That gets things done quickly and the end result is more certain. Just like that. Now they're trimmed to the right length. We'll put the saw back in the holder. Now we have one more thing we have to do. Right now, since we sawed off the end of the rod, it's just a flat square cut. It has a blunt end. And if you look at the original tip, which maybe you can see, it's got a semi-pointy tip on it. It's not super sharp, but it's not flat either. It is a tip because the reason that it would be pointed is you want to focus the force of the strike to a single point on the tip as much as you possibly can. So I'm going to move the camera because I always do the shaping on that end of the workbench, and I'm not going to try to do it on this end of the workbench because it's the wrong place for me to do it. So let me move the camera and I'll show you how to do that. All right, we're on the other end of the workbench, the part you never really get to see. So we have our purple sandpaper with all of the white marks on it from having done this a million times before. And since you guys are watching and everything, we're gonna flip it over and use the new side. Well, it's been used a little bit, but not too much. So what I do is I always put it on the edge like this, and then I hold this like this, make sure it's tight in the chuck. And first I'm gonna spin it just a little bit this way. And now I'm going to tip it up, see, tipping it up like this, tipping it up. And move it back and forth. Like that. And what you end up with is, see if I can show you this, a pointed tip. So that's one end. And now we'll do this one. And now that one is pointed. And that's how you make tips for the plungers inside a NuTone door chime. This works for all models of door chimes that have plungers which have holes in the end. There are some plungers that they made starting around the mid 80s or so that don't have holes. They have molded on tips on little flanges. I have a video about that. It's a completely different thing. Those can be repaired also, but it's an entirely different process. But this covers a wide range of plungers starting around 1950 and all the way through, say, the mid 80s. So it covers a huge number of chimes that NuTone made. I hope you found this interesting, and maybe for someone it will be helpful. If it is, give it a thumbs up on YouTube, because that helps us a lot. There'll be a banner right here that shows you how to subscribe. Go to our YouTube homepage, click on the bell, and when you click on the bell, click on it to receive all notifications, and you'll get a notification every time we post a new video. That's all for today. See you on the next video.